This morning's reading is from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, written in 1963. In it, he responds to religious leaders who urged him to wait patiently for justice. His words challenge us to examine not just overt injustice, but the quieter, more dangerous tendency to tolerate the intolerable in the name of order or peace. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of people willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use this time creatively, in the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do right. Now is the time to lift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity. This morning's message is brought to us by someone whose presence may often be quiet, but whose impact is anything but. Kelly Schaefer is a cherished member of our congregation, a pillar of courage in the face of hatred, a tireless advocate for justice, and one of our 3 resident miracle workers behind the AV booth. With a master's in public administration and nonprofit management, Kelly brings both heart and expertise to everything she does. She's also a veteran animal rescuer and someone whose commitment to compassion and truth runs deep. When she's not supporting our services from behind the scenes, she can be found engaging in the ever-challenging work of tracking current events and sharing informed perspectives through a Facebook group she runs called Texas Democrats Rising. Though she may prefer to work in the shadows, today she steps forward to share her voice, her insight, and her truth. Please join me in welcoming our fabulous and fiercely thoughtful friend, Kelly Schaefer.
Good morning. I want to take a moment and thank the team who helped put this service together. Always, thank you, Jan, for your guidance and wise counsel. You have an admirable gift for diplomacy. Thank you to Jorge and Peggy for personifying the values of diversity and inclusion. Thank you to Judith for your expertise in translating this message for the kids of UUNB and for the kids inside of each of us. And thank you for your emotional support as I navigated this project and for your friendship. Thank you to Jeff Jenkins and Carol Miller for being on standby to support should the need arise. Thank you, Yesenia, for so eloquently putting this message to music. Thank you, Rob, for watching over us while we gather in fellowship. And thank you to Cole and Aaron for always having my back and for trusting me to have your backs, for being the best teammates I could ask for, and for being the cherished friends I never expected to have. And finally, thank you, friends and members of UUNB, for spending your morning here with me. Austrian philosopher Karl Popper said, "Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. We should therefore aim in the name of tolerance. We should therefore claim in the name of tolerance the right not to tolerate the intolerant." According to a 2020 study by the Rand Corporation, in the past 45 years, roughly $50 trillion had trickled from the bottom 90% of the population to the top 1% as of that year. In the decades following World War II until the late 1960s, income levels were highly unequal when accounting for race and gender, but the inequality between income groups was much less stratified and was actually shrinking. Incomes for the middle and lower classes were increasing at about the same rate as the upper classes. Since roughly 1975, the wealthiest 1% and 0.1% have claimed increasing shares of the nation's economic growth, and their incomes have skyrocketed while everyone else has seen little gain and even a loss in income. The United States consistently ranks among the nations with the highest income inequality because of its reluctance to provide an adequate safety net. Such income scarcity weakens not only the 90%, it weakens the entire country, because with 90% of the country existing in a weakened economic state, the nation's economy is also in a weakened state. In a market income, we all do better when we all do better. When workers have more money, businesses have more customers, make more profits, expand their business, and hire more workers. High income inequality leads to higher rates of crime, mental illness, and physical illness. Historical social ills such as slavery, Japanese internment camps, and immigration problems are still associated with high levels of income inequality. Regarding slavery, industry metrics found a strong correlation between land inequality in 1860 and income inequality in 2000. The New Deal led to a rise in union membership and improved workers' rights. Following the end of World War II until the late 1960s, workers' compensation generally increased, as did labor productivity, increasing prosperity that was distributed more equitably. Even so, problems with poverty, inequality, urban decay, and limited access to health care and education were prevalent, and in 1964, President Johnson launched the War on Poverty. Funding for income security, including Social Security, unemployment insurance, aid to families with dependent children, and other programs that provided cash transfers or access to essentials, increased from 22% to 34% of the budget. Growth in Medicare and Medicaid grew from 1.5% of the budget to 10%. Budget expenditures for education, training, employment, and social services went from just under 2% to 5%. Altogether, the budget share of these initiatives went from 25% to 50%. Over the next 50 years, poverty did decline. Average incomes for the bottom 20% have risen significantly, infant mortality has dropped, and childhood malnutrition largely vanished, but problems still remain. In 2012, nearly 50 million Americans were poor, including 13 million children, and 16 million people lived below half of the poverty line. Large racial disparities still remain, with blacks experiencing much higher levels of child poverty and much lower levels of college education than whites. And the United States still provides much less of a safety net than other Western nations. Higher levels of education, smaller families, and higher employment levels for women have pushed poverty levels down, while rising numbers of single-parent families, worsening labor markets for less skilled workers, and the continuing income inequality have exerted upward pressure on poverty numbers. At the 50-year mark for the War on Poverty, studies showed that government intervention had kept the poverty level at roughly half of what it would have been without government intervention. Research shows that programs such as food stamps and the Earned Income Tax Credit have long-term positive educational and health benefits for children, increasing their chances of breaking the cycle of poverty and contributing to society. But since the mid-90s, the safety net for the poorest families with children and for poor adults has grown significantly weaker as cash welfare assistance has shrunk, particularly for jobless families. The critics still say that having a safety net disincentivizes people to work, despite research that has found overall that is not the case. When Reagan took office in 1980, he convinced Congress to enact a 3-year tax cut for higher income individuals and corporations, claiming it would stimulate his supply-side economics and create incentives for work, savings, and investments. He also enacted a massive $39 billion in budget cuts targeting programs like Social Security, Medicaid, food stamps, and education. Between the 1981 and 1986 tax cuts, the top marginal tax rate went from 70% to 28%. They brought significant reductions in revenue and no increases in consumption. There was no trickle down. While it did not last any longer than the recession of 1975, the recession of the early 80s was a much deeper recession and did much more damage to the economy, with unemployment lasting for several quarters longer than in 1975. The 1981 tax cut did not pay for itself, but increased the federal deficit and was largely rolled back through a series of tax increases starting in 1982. Once past the recession of 1981 to 83, the Reagan economy did take off. 20 million jobs were created, unemployment and inflation fell. Economic growth increased by a third. Part of the recovery was enabled by the tax increase of 1982, the second largest since 1968. But considering it merely offset the tax cut of the year before, it did not actually increase revenues. The national debt grew from 22% of GDP to 38%. Meanwhile, income inequality grew while poverty levels remained unchanged. The Clinton tax hike of 1993 was one of the largest fiscal deficit reduction packages in U.S. history. It increased the top individual income tax rate from 31% to just under 40%, and turned the fiscal deficit into a fiscal surplus by 1998. Republicans were against the plan. In a masterful display of political gamesmanship, the administration and Democratic committee chairs turned to the corporate sector for support. They mobilized CEOs, including Fortune 500 executives, who then lobbied key legislators, and with the support of the resulting coalition, the bill passed with a very slim majority. Clinton reined in the ballooning deficit left by Reagan, and for the first time since 1969, the nation had a budget surplus. 96% of small businesses were exempt from the tax hikes, and the spending package included provisions to help small businesses. In the end, the corporate tax rate was reduced from 2% to 1%. The CEOs who supported the plan proved reluctant to increase the tax rate on the businesses they were charged with running, but were more amenable to increases in their personal tax rates as a means to reduce the deficit rather than pay for increased spending on social programs, and because the lower tax rates on capital gains remained intact. With the Cold War ended, Clinton significantly cut defense spending. However, he was forced to acquiesce to some Republican demands on spending, including an additional $38 billion cut to Medicare. During the course of his presidency, Medicare was repeatedly chipped away, and welfare reform converted the program to fixed block grants to states. Eligibility rules were tightened, and requirements for work were strengthened. Clinton did add a children's health insurance program. The Clinton years still saw the biggest surge in income inequality, with the top 5% gaining just under 5%, while the bottom 20% gained just under 2%. The years from 1980 to 1990 had seen the bottom 20% actually lose income, while the top 5% grew their wealth by a little more than 3%. In 1988, while celebrating the budget surplus, Clinton said, "In 1983, the members of our party in Congress, some at the cost of their careers, took the courageous action which began the road we celebrate today, a new economic strategy that reduced the deficit by more than 90%. It is a landmark achievement, not just for those in this room who have played a role in it, but indeed for all the American people. And it will be a gift-giving achievement for generations to come." To which George W. Bush responded, "Hold my beer." Little more than 3 months in office, Bush signed the first of two massive tax cuts for the wealthy. 3 months after that, the attacks of 9/11 happened, and the rainy day surplus that was supposed to serve the American people for generations to come was a thing of the past. The U.S. invaded Iraq in March 2003 as the 2003 tax cut was making its way through Congress. The Senate reduced the tax cut by $100 billion to help pay for the war, while the administration argued that the tax cut would boost the economy and provide jobs for returning troops. The top 1% received a tax cut of over $500,000 between 2004 and 2012, or about 5% of their after-tax income. The tax cuts were not accompanied by cuts in spending, but were financed by borrowing and thus ballooned the national debt and therefore fueled the rise in income inequality. The Bush tax cuts were projected to be responsible for 1/3 of the national debt by 2018. It is estimated that in 2010, the year the tax cuts were fully phased in, they raised the after-tax income of the top 1% by 6.7%. The bottom 20% after-tax income increased by just 1%. Economic growth from 2001 to 2007, leading into the Great Recession, was mediocre at best. Contrast that to the economic expansion of the early 90s, which utilized significant tax increases on the wealthy and produced a much faster rate of job growth and a somewhat faster rate of GDP growth. With the response to 9/11 and the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, Bush increased spending more than any of the 6 presidents before him. He did add a Medicare prescription drug bill, and he added Pell Grant program funding for higher education. He also increased funding for elementary and secondary education programs and funding for state special education grants under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. The final year of his presidency saw the financial sector collapse and the Great Recession, which led to huge bailouts for Wall Street as the incoming Democratic president again inherited the outgoing Republican economic disaster. Obama enacted tax cuts for working families, including a child tax credit and a tax credit tied to college tuition. He made permanent tax cuts for 98% of Americans that were set to expire in 2010. These tax breaks brought middle-class tax rates to near historic lows. He reversed tax cuts for the wealthy and reinstated the top rate of nearly 40% established under Clinton. The richest 400 people paid $6.5 billion more than they would have under the old rules. The top 0.1% paid $50 billion more than they would have under the old rules. Obama's signature spending policy for the good of the 90% was, of course, the Affordable Care Act, which would be another lecture all in itself. During Reagan's presidential campaigns in 1976 and 1980, he repeatedly invoked the specter of the welfare queen of Chicago, a convenient and effective boogeyman to scare the public with visions of black people living high on the hog by committing welfare fraud. In reality, the criminal Reagan was referring to was involved in many criminal enterprises, including defrauding private individuals, kidnapping babies, and possibly even murder. Even more telling than Reagan's portrayal of this criminal as the face of rampant welfare fraud was the fact that the police declined to seek murder charges for fear it would detract from the ongoing welfare fraud case. You can get away with murder when inciting public hysteria for stealing welfare money is politically expedient. As neat and effective as Reagan's welfare queen of Chicago was, it was nothing compared to the right-wing propaganda machine he helped create. In 1983, the administration entered an unholy alliance with media mogul Rupert Murdoch. The goal was to create a propaganda machine that would move Americans to support U.S. interference in third world affairs. The mission was the ouster of the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. White House meetings between Reagan and Murdoch were facilitated by Charles Wick, director of the U.S. Information Agency, and Murdoch's lawyer, Roy Cohen. Wick wanted the U.S. to invest in satellite technology to counter Soviet propaganda, and Murdoch played a critical role in familiarizing Wick with emerging satellite technology. The result was the first U.S. global satellite television network, WorldNet, which revolutionized the country's ability to spread its influence around the world. In exchange, Murdoch gained the backing of the State Department and access to the latest technology with which to expand his own growing New Corp empire. Murdoch's news empire became the vehicle for spreading Republican propaganda. In 1985, the FCC released a report claiming the Fairness Doctrine hurt the public interest and violated free speech rights guaranteed by the First Amendment. In 1987, the 4-person FCC panel repealed it. Congress balked and tried to pass legislation codifying the Fairness Doctrine. Reagan vetoed the measure. With the demise of the Fairness Doctrine, Murdoch was free to pursue a more aggressive conservatism on his TV network. In 1996, he launched Fox News, with former Nixon campaign advisor, the late Roger Aiello, at the helm. Aiello was an unapologetic conservative fearmonger. He advised the presidential campaigns of both George Bush's, was best friend and mentor to Rush Limbaugh, and on election night 2000, while Florida was still in play, he instructed Fox News to call the election for Bush, prompting the other networks to do the same. As Dan Rather commented later, we will never know who actually won. Aiello's actions helped create the Tea Party and get them elected to Congress. Under Aiello, Fox News became the propaganda machine for the Republican Party and as such has enormous influence on the workings of the party and on the politics of the nation. Fox doesn't just influence voters with its unending white, hetero, cis resentment editorializing. It influences the politicians running the country, legitimizing and advancing the far-right agenda. David Frum, former Bush speechwriter, summed it up when he said, "Republicans originally thought that Fox worked for us. Now we're discovering that we work for Fox." Fox, Aiello, and Murdoch helped create the era of Trump, and now the Fox News audience has become a monster that owns Fox. When Murdoch tried to break from the lies about the stolen 2020 election, the Fox audience tuned out and Fox began losing market share. Murdoch backed down. Within two weeks, on-air personalities had questioned the results of the election 774 times. Fox viewers will not stand for anything that does not align with their distorted, fear-based, and hate-filled beliefs, beliefs originally seeded and cultivated by Fox itself. Fox and its fans are locked in a parasitic relationship that is threatening the entire country. The last time the United States let the wealthiest put their own interests before the good of the nation, the result was the Great Depression. From FDR's New Deal programs forward to Biden, the same patterns have held. Taxing the wealthy and providing safety nets for the bottom 90% works for everyone, including the wealthy. There's a pretty sound economic principle undergirding this philosophy. The goal is to increase consumption. Consumption precedes investment during an economic recovery. Only when consumption resumes does capital invest in jobs and production, thereby increasing the means for consumption. Even President Ford recognized this in his recovery plan for the 1975 recession with its high unemployment. He extended unemployment benefits and tax cuts for the lower and middle classes. His strategy worked, and the country pulled out of the 1975 recession. The Clinton administration proved that rising tides lift all boats. By making the wealthy pay something closer to their fair share and targeting economic resources to the 90%, the top 5% enjoyed the most disproportionate increase in income in the RAND study. Almost everyone did better under Clinton. But the scope of his ambition was curbed by the need to compromise with Republicans. By that time, the GOP was under the sway of the Fox propaganda machine. With then House Speaker Newt Gingrich at the helm, their agenda became not helping the American public or the country, but amassing power for power's sake. The propaganda campaign was ugly and relentless. They simply wanted Clinton to fail. This same agenda was employed during Obama's tenure, with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell abandoning any pretense of ethics in denying Obama a SCOTUS Supreme Court pick with the excuse that it was too close to the 2016 election, and later ramming through a Trump Supreme Court pick while the 2022 election was underway. The Democrats made an egregious error by not fighting back. The same tolerance for intolerance that is the fatal flaw in the DNA of liberal democracy. Democrats have not known what's coming at them since Reagan and Murdoch formed their unholy alliance. One has to assume that the nation's intelligence network understood a long time ago. It's on the internet. And yet Democrats have never fought back against the right-wing propaganda machine that is destroying the country from within, a true enemy domestic. The current administration is a far more destructive force than anything since the Civil War, or possibly McCarthyism. Our own government has declared war on its citizens. Many Democrats are in denial, calmly mouthing that age-old platitude, the midterms are just around the corner. With all due respect, no, they are not. They are a long year and a half away. if they come at all. Many people don't have the resources to hang on that long. To illustrate the extremes to which the right-wing propaganda machine has twisted our esteemed countrymen, it looks like local officials in some of the jurisdictions impacted by last week's floods actually turned down offers of federal funds from the Biden administration to install flood safety measures, claiming that the money was communist, socialist, some kind of unholy money. It's become all about owning the libs, even at the cost of innocent lives. I will close with a paraphrase of the quote I opened with. The paradox of tolerance is a philosophical concept suggesting that if a society extends tolerance to those who are intolerant, it risks enabling the eventual dominance of intolerance, thereby undermining